First correction with my myth, with the myth of how Natya is supposed to have evolved, going back to Bharata. I realized I made some mistake with the myth, so I'm going to retell the myth today. The story goes like this, that Indra requested Brahma to create a form that could be a diversion for people, because people were too obsessed with sensual pleasures, with desire, greed, jealousy, the standard motive that you will see in any culture, I presume. Therefore, he requested Brahma to create another Veda. Another aspect of it also was that he wanted to create a form that was accessible to everybody, including the Shudras, which had no Varna distinction basically, whereas the Vedas were limited to certain classes and castes. So that's how Brahma is said to have created Natya. I had said last time that Brahma had asked for the creation of Natya, so I'm just correcting myself. I knew there was something wrong with it. And Brahma creates it as a fifth Veda. He's supposed to have taken elements from the existent four Vedas to have created Natya as a form. And like I said, Natya is a theatrical form. It's not just a dance form itself. Of course, I think Indra also says it has to be something that is oral and create something that has both music and dance and talk, speech, I presume. Then the first performance. And why is Bharata chosen? Bharata is chosen because he is the ideal among all the sages to take this and learn this and perform this. He teaches it to 100 sons of his. Certain scholars believe that the word son can also be interpreted as pupils, not necessarily biological children. And the first performance is said to have taken place in a festival which was honoring Indra. It is after that they went to Shiva and presented this form. And then Shiva, through Tandu, asks Tandu to teach them the Tandava. And then the story goes on. Okay? So basically I'm just retelling the story so we understand that it was Brahma who created the fifth Veda known as the Natya. This is one thing I'd like to just say here is that there is this whole idea of this 108 Karanas. I don't know how many of you heard of this. Now if you go to the Chidambaram temple, you have samples of it. Like I told you, in the Brihadishwara temple in Tanjore, you have 104 I think, or 105 or 8, 3 of them are not completed or something. They are supposed to be combined movements of the hand and the feet. What you see is a still of what is presumed as a final position of the movement that it ends at. Why I am stating this here is that in the modernist movement there has been this attempt to, shall we say, rediscover these Karanas. So one of many dancers have tried to say, let's reconfigure them and bring them back into Bharatanatyam or the modern dance. Padma Subramaniam is one of the famous scholars who supposed to have shall we say, imagined the Karanas. But of course it is a moment of controversy, because what is there in the sculpture is a final position. How that position was arrived at is up to anybody's interpretation. So Padma Subramaniam has created a certain idea of how the final 108, each of those positions were arrived at. And of course she has incorporated that in her dance. There are other dancers who have also experimented with that. I'm just saying that because this is also part of this whole idea of trying to rediscover something that's locked up in a text. This also brings the whole discourse of this whole text versus the performative or the actual form. So when you go back to text, for example, if I'm just going to talk about that for a second before I go on, when you go back to text and try to create relevance of the text with the form that you're practicing, then you're bound to create issues that are inbuilt in that kind of an interpretation. And so one is not really redoing the text, but one is actually giving the text life again in a modern context. Though the word modern will be never used in any of these forms. We will never use the word modern, but what we are doing is utterly modern. Okay? And so therefore this is there in Bharatanatyam, this is there in music. One more thing about the Natya Shastra before I go on, just to give you a sweep of what all it covers. It's quite, I just thought I should last time, I forgot. It's quite a magnificent text, like I said, the whole aesthetic spectrum. So from the origin to how a theatre should be built for performance, what are the pujas to be done to the theatre before performances are started there, the whole idea of the rasas which we discussed, abhinaya, prosody in poetry, metrical patterns, what a play is, how the languages should be used, kinds of plays there are the interpretations that there could be, what is instrumental music, what is percussion music, what is the nature of mankind, man and woman, what are characters and roles, what are the roles that can be shown on stage, what are the roles that you don't show on stage. Now is, for example, death being displayed on stage is one of the problematic points. So it covers the whole spectrum of what could be called theatre and also pre-theatre forms. Now, one part of the Natya Shastra is what is known as the Purvaranga. Purvaranga is what is presented before the play begins, which I discussed in my music lecture, and that's where Bharata talks about Gandharva or pure music for the gods. So that's presented almost like a ritual before the play opens. And part of that ritual could also be some dance, but there are many interpretations, many varieties of that. So just to give you a sweep that it's quite an exhaustive, yeah. In Natya Shastra, if you look at it, it describes a certain practice. No, it describes, but tells you do's and don'ts in relation to that practice. In relation to that practice, there's do's and don'ts. Now, what it seems to be is that he is reporting. Or is he saying that this is a ritual? Well, I think he's doing both at some levels. You know, he's kind of doing both because it's in a way a little ironic, if I may say, because if you look at the origin, it's supposed to be something that's accessible to everybody. I mean, if you take the myth that it should be non-classist or non-casteist, but you read some of the sections of the whole form, it does seem to cater to one set of society, one set of people with certain aesthetic intentions, with certain aesthetic ideas. So in that way, it's a little dicey to look at it. I think it is both descriptive and prescriptive, because there are points which say this cannot be done. You can't present this on stage. You can do this, you can't. That is also there. So it's both. For example, in Gandharva, which is the musical part, there are great conditions and rules and regulations on what cannot be done and what can be done. So I think it's a combination of both descriptive and prescriptive. But I think it is a record. If I was going to record Carnatic music today, or Bharatanatyam as we see it today, on stage, accepting the do's and don'ts as accepted today, not being critical of it, you would get a text like what a Natya Shastra is. Because he is describing practice of a certain social order as seen at their time, and he is describing it and also saying this is how it should be. Is he personally saying this is not to be done, or is he saying that this is what is not done? No, he is saying both. See, after all, he is supposed to be the creator. If you see Natya Shastra, he talks about himself. He talks about how he was given this form. Right? Because after all, it was given to Bharata. Yeah. So that kind of lays the ground for it. Brahma gave it to Bharata to teach his children. And the moment you also create a kind of a divine gift out of it, then I think the do's and don'ts also play along with a certain idea of sanction from beyond. So then it has a very different, I think, mindscape in terms of how we receive it. So I'm just want to just touch upon this before. So I want to correct my mythological error before I go on. I think we had stopped, today we'll do two parts. We'll try and look at, we had stopped somewhere in the 19th century, I think last time. And I had mentioned the Tanjore Quartet, I think, which is Chinnaya, Ponnaya, Shivanandam and Vadivelu. 4 people. Like I told you, there were the 4 students of Muthuswami Dikshitar, the great Carnatic musician. And they are said to have given body structure to what was revisioned and is accepted today as Bharatanatyam. Okay? What do you mean by body and structure? The compositions, the compositional types, the structuring, all somehow are rooted back to these four figures. Now there are compositions of people even before them that are presented, not that it's not, I'm just clarifying. Some compositions are older. Like I remember, I think Vidya sang one line of the Usaini Swarajiti for you people. That, if you look at it period wise, is probably before these four people. So that is also sometimes dance. But in terms of overall form, structure, we can definitely say it is, if you look at Bharatanatyam today, it goes right back to these four people. Some compositional forms may have been older than their presence, but the fact that it could be danced, it's danced in, allowed to be danced on stage as part of this form that we call Bharatanatyam, again I think comes from certain acceptance of the quartet and their structuring of what is a stage performance of this art form. Like I said, I'll reiterate one more thing. The Devadasi was occupying different spaces. She was occupying the ritual space, the social space, the space of almost the divine catalyst, and the space of being purely an artistic body who was also creating just art. So it is in this multiple modes, out of all this, that you have the idea of then called Sadir, but not just retitled but reinvented as Bharatanatyam. Now, there are a few figures that are important in this whole discourse. I think the first section I'll talk about this. Second section I'll talk about the actual forms, play some videos for you, and go through what is ironically called the Margam in Bharatanatyam. I'll tell you why it's ironically called the Margam. There are a few important figures who play a very important role in how Bharatanatyam came into being. Again, it's important to realize Bharatanatyam is a modern creation. It's pretty much a creation of 20th century. With tools, with ideas, with techniques, with even the essence that may have been there through history, but as a form now. Two or three characters. One important person is a man called E. Krishna. And I'm just, instead of me lecturing, I'm going to read out a slightly long passage, but it's very interesting. This is a lovely book by Amanda Wiedemann. It's called Singing the Classical, Voicing the Modern, the Post-Colonial Politics of Music in South India. It's a book on music, actually. Fabulous scholar, lovely book. But there is this whole section on E. Krishna and the Devadasis, which we had discussed, which I'm just going to read out to you because it kind of gives you an idea of who this E. Krishna is and what his role was. Okay. If the official debate about Devadasis came by the early decades of the 20th century to center on Devadasis' property rights and alleged prostitution, it is because the matter of their music and dance had been effectively removed from the discourse on Devadasis and relocated to a realm now self-consciously referred to as art. Separating the woman question from the question of what constituted art enabled art to have a trajectory apart from its practitioner's life. This is very important to note, that the moment you separate art from the woman, then the art could get a separate life away from the context of the lives of the woman who was practicing that art form. Okay? It was precisely because revivalists like E. Krishna and Rukmini Devi considered the music and dance of Devadasis to be part of an ancient tradition that extended far beyond the lives of specific Devadasis, that these practices could assume the status of art. In the 1920s and 1930s, at the height of the campaign to end the Devadasi system, both Brahmins and non-Brahmins involved with the Tamil Renaissance began to speak about the revival of Indian classical arts. They used the word art or the Tamil term kalai is art, to signify a generalized concept of art rather than a particular practice like music or painting. In this discourse, the distinction between art and craft was essential. where craft implied hereditary practitioners who worked repetitively and unthinkingly, art implied an individual artist, a subject who made choices, was original, and somehow expressed herself through her art. In the early 1930s, a number of prominent members of the Congress Party in Madras, including E. Krishnaiyer, Thirumalaiya Naidu, and T. Prakasam, defined this position bluntly as pro-art, maintaining that the extremity of Muthu Lakshmi Reddy's anti-notch movement was killing the art of the Devadasis. See, that's the whole fabulous thing. It's killing the art of the Devadasis. What about the Devadasis? That question is a different question. So you separate the two questions, then you start perceiving it differently. In a pamphlet entitled Music and the Anti-Notch Movement, written in circa 1912, Thirumalaiya Naidu, an advocate by profession, stated that the anti-notch movement had been negative in character, set up to demolish the long-standing institution of art of the Devadasis. E. Krishnaiyer represented the pro-art position even more vociferously. Now, who is E. Krishnaiyer? He was born in 1897 in Kalladekurichi, a small town in South Tamil Nadu, known then for its lavish musical dance events in connection with weddings, or side story, weddings. A side story here is Kalladekurichi in the musical world is very famous for a famous Carnatic music battle. Apparently there were two streets. One street, there were fanatics of G.N. Balasubramaniam. The other street are supposed to be fanatics of Shammagudi Srinivasa Iyer. It's almost like Rajinikanth Kamal Haasan battle. Okay, I'm serious. I'm very serious. It's really that. And the whole story is any wedding on this street, the only musician who would sing is G.N. Balasubramaniam. Any wedding on that street will be Shammagudi. And of course, each would spy on the other and talk about how rubbish the other concert was. So this is a side story, but just to tell you that Kalladekurichi is very famous for this whole battle between GNB and Shammagudi. Anyway, while completing his law degree in Madras Law College, Krishnaiyer acted female roles in dramas, studied Carnatic music on the violin. So he learnt Sadir. He later joined the Sugana Vilas Sabha, a prominent theatrical group in Madras, and received formal training in Sadir, the dance form of the Devadasis. Committed to reviving the dance, he was instrumental in setting up the Madras Music Academy and bringing dancers, first Devadasis and then Brahmins, to the stage. In a series of letters against Muthulakshmi Reddy's condemnation of all public performances of Notch, published in Madras Mail 1932, Krishnaiyer mobilized public support for his pro-art position. In addition, he was behind Music Academy's 1932 resolution, this is important, to rename the dance Bharatanatyam, or Indian dance. The word Bharata gave the dance an image of national importance. At the same time, the use of the Sanskrit word Natya suggested its origin in the Sanskrit treatises of dance. The idea was not necessarily to help Devadasis continue to practice their art. It was rather to rid music and dance of their impure associations. Music and dance had to be rescued from the hands of degenerate Devadasis and taken up by women from respectable, that is Brahmin, families. The most prominent upholder of the... This is the opinion of the writer. Yes. The most prominent upholder of this idea was Rukmini Devi, one of the first Brahmin women in the 20th century to perform South Indian dance and the founder of Kalakshetra, one of the first institutions to teach music and dance in Madras. They go on to say a lot more, but this is essentially... See, it's very fascinating, this whole discourse. So in some way, the idea of appropriation is inbuilt in this discourse, where the art is taken to be something very ancient, and the art practiced by a community is taken to be only as being a part, only one section of the art. Therefore, even if that goes, the art lives. So the community in a way become after a point important from whom you gather what is there, but not necessarily the true holders of the art form. So it's a very fascinating discourse that was happening. And Rukmini Devi here is very important. Just like D.K. Pattamal in Carnatic music was the first prominent Brahmin woman to sing Carnatic music on stage, Rukmini Devi Arundel was the first Brahmin woman to really take up Bharatanatyam, or take up what was rechristened to be Bharatanatyam on stage. See, Rukmini Devi's story itself is very interesting, because she learnt from...
So was the implication that they were only mere conduits of an ancient...
Exactly. So the point was, it's a little problematic, that kind of a position, because they were the only people who practiced this art. And as we have seen, there were Devadasis practicing Sadir for at least 1,000 years in whatever different forms it was. I'm not saying it is the same continuum, just saying in whatever different forms it was. But the problem was because of the social political condition that had happened over the last 50, 60 years, where the community was a problem. If you think this is a great art form, but it's an art form being practiced by impure prostitutes, how do you possess it as the classical? Because one of the important parts of the idea of the classical is a certain sense of purity. This is there in any classical. You look at Western classical music, they may not use religious purity, but they use a purity of a different form. There is a certain purity, sanctity attached to the form of the classical that is there in the West also. So how does one give this form a certain purity? I also will accept here that this part of this is also a certain strong belief in people like E. Krishna and Rukmini Devi. That is a great art form. I mean, nobody is then denying that belief that could have been very strong. But the problem is that the people who are practicing it become very problematic. So how does one take the art, revitalize it with a history, with an antiquity? You change the term, you change a Tamil term to a Sanskrit term. That, I think, is a very big shift. You call something from Sadir to Bharatanatyam. In fact, I would even go to propose what are the reasons why Bharatanatyam is today an international face of Indian dance, not only because of a lot of personalities like Bala Saraswati and Rukmini Devi, etc., is also the sheer name. The name itself has a pan-Indian class identity. I mean, it's not that was the agenda of giving it the name, but I mean, the writer seems to suggest that, but may not be the agenda, but the fact that it gives it is something that we need to just observe. So, I mean, this is it's really fascinating on how this battle it had played. So, Rukmini Devi is a very important figure. See, Rukmini Devi herself had learnt from Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai. I'm going to talk about the Nattuvanars, but I'll just mention it. She had learnt from traditional Nattuvanars. See, they were the only source to learn this art form. Let's be very clear. There was no other way to learn Sadir. You had to learn it from a traditional member of that community. Nobody else was the source. So she also learnt it. But then she is from the Theosophical background. I'd like you all to just do some homework on Theosophy, because it's very important in this whole game. Just Google search it. I mean, just do some simple search, even from Wiki is fine. You know, just to give an idea of what Theosophy was all about, because it plays a very important role in these ideas. Rukmini Devi, well, it is said that Annie Besant had, I think, three. The Tamil word is varisu. What is the English word for varisu? Heirs. That's right. Thank you. Rukmini Devi Arundel, J. Krishnamurti, and the poet, what's his name, who became the defense minister of India? Krishna Menon. Yes, Krishna Menon. So this, I mean, one of the suggestions is the philosophical heir was supposed to be J. Krishnamurti, the artistic, cultural heir was supposed to be Rukmini Devi, the political heir was Krishna Menon. And I must say, unfortunately for Annie Besant, except for Rukmini Devi, who predominantly remained in the realm of Theosophy, J. Krishnamurti threw it out of the window and said this whole thing is a load of rubbish. Krishna Menon did not succeed in his political ambitions because of various reasons. So, but they are supposed to have been the real heirs of the Theosophical movement in three different arenas that pretty much covers society, if you look at it: culture, politics, and philosophy. So this is what is said. I mean, how far it's true, but they were very strong figures that cannot be denied. So Rukmini Devi comes from a certain very strong Theosophical background. I mean, Arundel was part of the Theosophical movement, and so there is multiple things that comes to it. That comes to the idea that this whole is a land of rishis. The Himalayas is where the rishis have given this. J. Krishnamurti was supposed to have been the modern rishi. He was supposed to have been the modern rishi who came through these voices and these, these unknown mystical sound, philosophical outpourings that are there from time immemorial, that come through human body, through different rishis, and J. Krishnamurti was supposed to be that rishi for the Theosophical movement. And he, to be honest, he held on to that role for quite some time before he threw it away. But he played that role for a long time, he did. So in this, Rukmini Devi also was part of that belief system. Of course, Theosophy is far more complicated in its own philosophical, religious beliefs, but that apart. So if you look, even now, if you look at Kalakshi, so this is where the most important debate happened. The debate of the idea of vulgarity and the idea of sanctity. Now, this is the most crucial debate that happened in the early 20th century vis-a-vis dance in India, especially South India, especially in the creation of Bharatanatyam. One of the most